Hey, you're Addison Brasil.
Yeah, I am. Hi, random British guy.
Didn't you write First Year at Grief Club, a gift from a friend who gets it?
Yes, I did. Did my mom pay you to ask me that?
No, I'm sorry for your loss, mate. Why don't you do a podcast to help people honor their grief?
You know, you're not the first person to say that. You know what? Fine, I'll do it. But it has to be with my friends who get it. And it has to be for real people who get real life grief. Oh, and it absolutely has to be equal parts honor the journey and find the funny.
What does that mean?
I think you're about to find out. I'm Addison Brasil. Grief Club, the podcast starts now.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Grief Club, the podcast, where I take parts of my book, First Year of Grief Club, a gift from a friend who gets it, and use them as a launching point to have deeper conversations. Today, we are talking about being angry and feeling all our emotions and the journey that comes with that in the grief process. This is around week 14 in the book, and I wanted to use this as a launching point to talk to one of my favorite friends who's just really, I mean, honestly, the perfect guest for this. Rachel Kaplan is here. Hello, hello. She is a psychotherapist, but most importantly, an emotional potty trainer, which is exactly why we're going to talk to her at this time in our grief journey. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So one thing I always do, and you'll be no stranger to this, I've kept this as part of my life, is checking in to start off so we know where we're coming from in this conversation. So I'm going to invite you to take a deep breath. And in one word, how are you feeling emotionally right now?
Emotionally, I'm feeling excited.
I'm going to say excited too, actually. And one word, how are you feeling physically?
Physically, I got a lot of phlegm in my body right now.
I'm going to say congested as well, actually. So now for anyone listening,
Very concise way to say that.
Freely cough through this because we have
You've been
addressed
warned.
it and acknowledged it. And in one word, how are you feeling mentally?
I feel open mentally.
I feel curious. I feel like, not that I need to explain my one word, but I'm always interested of where I think this may go and what I get to learn in the process. I love these conversations. So to start off, I mean, I know you in my own way, but I always like to, we're all living, breathing things, give the guests an opportunity to just openly honor their journey for a few minutes. Let us get to know you from your perspective. You can include grief and how it's played a role in your life, or you can skip it. There are no rules here, but yeah, let's hear what honoring the journey for Rachel has been like and how it got to where you are today.
Well, what a beautiful question, and definitely doesn't make sense to skip the grief for me. Yeah, I mean, my journey with, everything except music, which I'm obsessed with, but all the things I'm really passionate about and doing with my life, the healing work, the psychoeducation work, or the emotional potty training work, all started back when I was a young teenager, my first love. And I like to say first attachment, which is not totally true because of course I had a attachment to my parents who kept me alive in my early years. But I also had a lot of aversion with them. And so it was the first person that I met that I just wanted to be as close to as possible in the obsessive way a 14 or 13-year-old would. So it was definitely not healthy, not balanced. But that person was this first boyfriend of mine. And I was just kind of looking for him. That relationship took me down a road where he was clearly in a lot of pain and ended up, after a convoluted story and lie, taking his life when we were both almost 15. And I was really pulled into it and trapped, unable to stop him based on what I understood would happen if I tried to stop him. And his suicide note was just kind of like a nickname, based in a nickname, but like make sure I didn't do it too. Because my 14-year-old strategy to try to stop him from taking his life was to say I would do it too. So, you know, by 15, I was gifted an intolerable pain from this human who was clearly dealing with an intolerable pain. And I think, and I know you know suicide, and I think, you know, all death is of a loved one can be life-changing and annihilating, but I think suicide has its own flavor of hellish pain around the self-blame. And so, you know, I would say for a few years, I just tried to, I mean, for a little bit, I actually was planning to kill myself. Interestingly, in the room with my mom and his brother, and the moment they had found his body, I heard a voice, and I'm not someone who hears voices, luckily, but there was a very clear voice that said, "You will never do this to yourself." And it was not of the material world. I don't know. It's hard to say if it was inside or outside, but it's very clearly stated. But I did for a few years kind of plan to die. I didn't do a very good job, obviously, thank God. And I also would say that for a few years, I totally just moved into my mind. I've always had a pretty sharp mind, really fast mind. So I was just like, I'm just going to think. And that worked decently. I became very jaded, very sarcastic. And then in the next time I tried to have a relationship, which started when I was 16, I realized, oh my God, like I have a significant challenge. If this person was out of my sight, I would act like he was dead. And so I began my therapeutic journey. And I've only really had one fantastic individual therapy experience with an individual therapist. And it was this first therapist. Her name is Wendy. We have since reconnected. And interestingly, I found out my podcast is mandated listening for her clients.
Wow.
Pretty amazing. And I actually have an episode where I interviewed her. But basically, she was someone in light of your topic who really helped me start to, you know, get back into my body. She was like, I would come in and babble and talk. And she was like, and she actually encouraged me to only use 4 words to describe my feelings, which while limiting, actually what it did is it demanded me to start feeling them. And so that was, you know, 16, 17, I started a journey of coming back into my emotions. And really my entire life, I'd say by 18, I had my first big healing experience, which was actually when that boyfriend I was with left me again, which was interesting because it was like coming back to the thing I was terrified of, to realize I wasn't in the same spot, that it wasn't a circle, it was a spiral. And then I got into my early 20s, I got really into Eastern religions and spirituality, and I lived in India and Nepal and started meditating and doing yoga. And then I kind of realized, oh my God, I've been meddling with everyone's life around me, trying to save them because I felt so guilty. So I took a few years off from that, and I didn't, and also from smoking weed, because my little self was like, everything's great and vibrating. But I was like, yeah, it is. You don't need to like enhance it. But so I kind of got really grounded, really sober, and stopped messing with anyone or giving really from this place of guilt. And it was quite a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years before I actually started training myself, first as a yoga teacher, and then eventually as a therapist, where I started inching back into this role of a healing helper or a healing catalyst. I began therapy school out in California at 24 and have been seeing clients since 26. I'm 42 at this point, so I'm at like 17 years-ish of that practice. And what I would say is, you know, while I was always like a natural, you know, I was always gifted with helping people with their feelings. Because one thing to know and something to look for the people listening in a therapist is if someone hasn't really had to go through hell and learn how to feel their pain, they're not going to be able to sit with you and yours in a meaningful way. They might be able to moan empathically and look like they're doing a great job, for sure. It's a great job. Lots of people do it. But I think when looking for someone, and this is why you're so perfect in the role you're in and with the book, it's like you really want someone who's walked that path and who isn't going to be afraid of the experiences you're having while you walk that path. And so I was always naturally gifted in that way, but I would say that I was still walking around the world with a tremendous amount of shame and like self-loathing tucked deep in my inner psychic folds. And some people are like, you're welcome, everyone who's having that experience. But and it wasn't until actually I did very deep work with someone totally outside the therapeutic realm. It was like an earth-based healer in the American Southwest, who was using like kind of traditional techniques and like, you know, things like making cordage, bringing forth fire, while really teaching me how to connect in the most direct way to my emotions and how to move my emotions out of my body. I did that work for about 4 years while being in a hideous marriage, which turns out was like the total spitting archetype of my dead boyfriend, because I'm really good at finding the, you know, daddies and the Keiths, that's the boyfriend's name. Anyway, and it wasn't until I actually left that marriage and without effort ended up leaving on the 22-year anniversary of the boyfriend's death, and then moved into this apartment building. And I was supposed to move in on a Monday, but it was rainy that day, so it got pushed back a day. So I moved in on the dead boyfriend's birthday. So talk about this like karmic clearing. But it was that relationship, that marriage, and the healing work I did. And by the way, they had the same first name, the husband and the healer, but the healer's last name is Grand. So I was like having this life-changing Doug sandwich. Anyway, I don't normally use the healer's name, but there you have it. So and I would say it's been since then, that was in 2017. So it's been the last 5 years. And it took about a year for me to be like, oh my God, I actually fully love myself, you know, and I was out in the world and doing international touring and by myself, but I was like, wow, I really actually have healed in a way that I think most people aren't doing. And really the crux of the work with the healer in the desert, you know, was around the dead boyfriend. It's like certain losses, and I don't mean to scare people when they hear this, certain losses, certain pains are insidious and take the better portion of our lives to like learn to heal and feel. And maybe that will be less with tools like your book and like the expertise that you're bringing and the work that I'm doing. There's like certainly a movement happening in the world that I am like deeply committed to. I call it the feelings movement. That's my handle on TikTok. But it's like, how do we learn as humans how to feel our pain skillfully so that we can actually heal it? Because for me, at the end of the day, it wasn't all the fancy words. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a decade plus of sitting as a therapist. It was learning and gaining the access and the strength to actually experience my raw emotional pain as sensation in my body in a way where I could clear it and move it through me, that enabled me to heal and release the backlog of all that pain and shame, come into present time and include the parts of me that were in so much pain. Part of why, you know, emotional release work, as I call it, and leads to self-love is that when we want to avoid our pain, our emotional pain, and I'm almost done with my whole bio. I'm not trying to get too preachy, but just to like bring it full circle. When we want to avoid our emotional pain, we have to actually keep the parts of us that are in pain separate of us. And so whether those parts were like, you know, our sensitivity, our sexuality, some kind of unique, quirky gift that got mocked in whether at home or at school, you know, we actually try to sever ourselves from those parts so that we don't have pain. And so then we walk around feeling like an imposter and a fake because so many like deeply essential, unique, beautiful parts of us are like pushed into our emotional basement. And so when we learn, how do we find those parts? How do we form a relationship with them that might be strong enough where they feel safe and they trust us? They start to forgive us for shoving them in a basement closet for 20 years, you know? Then we start to bring them back and then we can clear out their pain. Well, guess what? Once they're included and once they're not carrying a whole lot of pain, we feel whole. We're like, oh, I'm a whole person. The quirky, weird self. And I'm strong, I'm good, I'm bright, I'm sensitive, I'm challenged, I'm, you know, whatever. We begin to feel like a whole person. And that's where we have the opportunity to love ourselves as we are. And we're not, you know, carrying around 30-year-old emotional poops. So it's really been, you know, grief and loss and an intolerable pain has really 100% set the arc of my life. And the work that I'm doing now, you know, I have no desire to bring in babies. It's like the desire I have is to like help the world and the humans of the world get better at, you know, taking emotional poops, releasing the pain. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for that grief. And so that is my story for you.
I love that. And what a journey. And anybody listening can tell why I keep Rachel in my life, because you're a badass who honors the journey, but, you know, quite clearly. Always willing to find the funny as well, which is just, so important to me. I have to ask one of my template questions I ask everybody before we dive any deeper specifically. If someone walked up to you on the street and said, "What is grief?" What is grief?
Poetically, grief is the cost of loving.
Hmm.
Grief is the flip side of loving, because in life, in our human lives, maybe it's different in some other plane, we lose, so grief is the ache of loving and losing.
I love that. And I love that. And from our episode with Mary Frances O'Connor, we learned that, grief really starts with love. When, like you said, when you build the attachment, in our brains, from a neuroscience point of view. I've just been geeking out with all these conversations. But yeah, so this week we are talking about anger to begin with, because I do think that anger is something that, when we start to notice what's going on with ourselves, especially in the beginning of grief, is something that really comes up in a very strong way, in an alarming way. And just to normalize it, I'll even share, I remember after my dad passed away, obviously you can see it's so clearly difficult for me to describe my dad's death. And I also want to be open right now that today is also like a very special conversation. It is the eve of the 10th anniversary of my father's suicide. And so everything I'm bringing to this conversation today is, I was going to cancel and I decided to show up. So I am very much a member of Grief Club today as we talk. And I just want you to know that as well, and to openly say that. So if I get overly emotional at any point, it has been a day where I'm taking my own advice and feeling it all. I wish I never, ever offered that to anyone and not to myself. But I do remember very, very specifically that there was this moment where I don't even remember what my mom said, but it was a few days after my dad had passed, and I just went into rage. She said something and I said something like, well, maybe you should do it. And I remember wanting to grab the microwave and throw it across the room. And if you know anything about me, I was the kid growing up that you couldn't, punish other kids in front of, because I was so sensitive and empathetic to like other people's pain, that like, this is just not like, I never would be like, let's fight, that will resolve this. Like, that's just not my go-to, is to, to be, kind of dive into anger and then physically even, enact it, take action based on it. But then I remember going back to my room and sort of recoiling, and it was at a time where, we had cell phones and my mom was in her room and I was in my room, and I text my mom and I said, I'm really sorry for what happened downstairs. I understand that that is absolutely inappropriate and not acceptable. And keep in mind, for everyone at home, this isn't like this motherly mother. This is someone who's co-parented my whole life, very young, like we were, almost like siblings in a lot of ways. But I still felt this much shame around what had just happened, that I said, obviously my younger sister should never see anything like that again. I think I should look for an apartment until I fix this. Now there's just a lot there. There's just a lot there, because this is 4 days after my father's suicide. I've already lost my brother at this point. And my mom responded saying, this is your home and you are safe to feel everything you feel right now.
So beautiful.
Thank God. And, I'm always so grateful that, that I had those responses in these moments, because it's obviously the seed of even where this chapter in the book comes from. Just that, allowing me to experiment even with something as like such intense anger, and her normalizing it and even making me feel healthy about it without the knowledge that, she's just an everyday person doing this. But anyway, I remember just that almost coming into my life, like almost like the same way we found out about COVID, like this, like, what is this thing that can turn me in a second, and that is driving so many of my thoughts, and I'm ruminating on it. It's like, I love my dad and I love my brother, but I'm so angry, and I'm not even sure if I'm angry at them or at myself or everyone else for not making it better. But it's just, anger was just something I had never dealt with in this way. And it went from 0 to like, do I need anger management like so quickly? So that's my experience from, within Grief Club. And I just want to use that sort of as a launching point to just talk about anger very generally, like from that point of view, when anger shows up for the first time in grief or recurringly, we'll get to as well.
Right. Well, it's a beautiful story. And I'm glad your mom also just had the wisdom to know that that was just part of your human experience. And just to scale back for a second and take it out of just the grief context. I mean, anger, and you use the word anger management at the end of that story. Anger is, I think, the most misunderstood emotion, even in the therapeutic world, because the way that it's talked about is often as something to be managed or something only that's layering over another experience. There's a lot of really wise people out there saying, your anger is really just covering your grief. And not to say that that's not true and that it isn't a layer cake of anger and grief, but anger it's one of the core basic primary human experiences. Like you can't get, if you look at colors, you can't get more basic than the 3 primary colors, right? And I look at emotions, there's 4 primary, 5 if you include happy, but 4 wounded, kind of like injured emotions that are just primary for everyone. And which means that they are valuable and important on their own. And part of the way that my mentor, who really helped me the most, helped me understand the emotions is looking at them as elements. And in his world experience, that the emotions are actually built of elements, like and elements being water, earth, air, fire. So do you want to guess what would correlate to anger?
Fire for 800.
And look, I'm wearing a red shirt for it. Absolutely. So what's cool about looking at anger as fire is it helps us look at how do we relate to fire? Is fire bad? Is fire bad? Now we know fire is destructive. We know fire can take out your house, can take out a forest, can ruin your life, right? But we relate to it, and we relate to it with care. So if we're cooking on fire, we're going to be aware of the heat. We're going to be careful with our hands. If we're making a fire in our home or in the wild, we're going to contain it. We're going to have a fireplace or a fire pit, right? So that we don't destroy things. And similarly, anger is a really important emotion that helps us process and digest, that helps us transform. And that's what fire does. It transforms, right? It takes one thing, it destroys it, it turns it into something else, whether it's cooking food or burning wood and making it smoke or whatever, I think it fuels cars, fire.
I love this analogy. Yeah. It's really hitting home.
Yeah. And so we need it. And what we need to do in order to be skillful with it, in order to not destroy our lives and things we care about is kind of similar if you were to look at fire management. Ideally in the wild, to not have a raging forest fire, they have little contained burns. And so particularly for humans who have been taught, and I think women more than men have been taught this, that it's not okay to be angry. Men, I think, like if you look back a few generations, that was actually the one emotion you could, and I say this in quotes, it's like that people conditioned as men were allowed to feel and still be like strong men, right? And so, and my father, for example, like all of his feelings look like anger. He's sad, he's scared, he's like, Rachel, Andy, it's like, because that's what he felt safe feeling. And so, the people who love him have learned to work with that presentation, right? So there's people have varying degrees of permission inside to feel anger, but most of us, and even in the world of people trying to help people heal, are trying to control it. And what happens, imagine if you take something explosive and you just like try to manage it, it's like eventually it explodes. And just to say real quick, like the flip side of, there's the people who are angry about everything. They're like swearing and flipping people the bird while driving. Everything's a big deal. And then there are the people who have been trained out of their anger, who it presents more like martyrdom, where they're just like giving of themselves. They have no boundaries. And guess what that finally leads to eventually is like a big explosion in resentment. Because fire doesn't work like that. You can't just like shove it in a box and never have it present itself in a destructive way. So what I teach for anyone, and I'm gonna connect it to grief in a moment, is learning what is it like to create a space, that container where you can come in and actually rile yourself up about what you're angry about and release it in a very physical way, because anger, like all the feelings, is physical, but it's the most physical, right? Like our arms we're like, it's like we have to move it in the body. So whether it's like, and there's a range of mobility for people who don't have as much mobility. You could scream, you could wring out a pillow, you could take a towel or a racket or a bat and hit a bed or a couch. The thing that I did in my journey with anger is I would chop wood with an axe, which is a little bit, you have to have access to a forest and an axe. You have to be safe with an axe. So I'm not necessarily telling your listeners to do that, although it's really satisfying. Oh my God.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that is part of the experiment of the week is what are some safe outlets? What are some opportunities where you take your anger into that room? Like there's these places now that the break rooms where you can go in and break
it's
things,
amazing.
and people don't know about these things. And it's we'll get into it more, but like finding the place where you can bring the fire and it's even encouraged and healthy to deal with it within that safe space, like you're saying.
Yeah. So there's ways to create like anger practices or anger release sessions that will help both in clearing the backlog of anger that you haven't had permission to feel throughout your life. And also you could use that in your grieving process. So as far as grieving, whether the person broke up with you or they had some tragic death or it's just like fuck cancer or something like that, it's actually to allow yourself to be mad at the universe, God, the person for smoking a pack a day every day, the person for choosing to end their life, the person for choosing to end the relationship. It doesn't matter. It's like to give ourselves permission to feel that. And in this way, when you're doing anger release sessions where you're actually part of what you're doing, like the early step of that would be to slow down and actually connect to all the things you're mad about to kind of rile yourself up. And then you do the release work. Sometimes it might dip into tears or more of a sadness release. But you would try to rile yourself up again and try to do it for like 10 to 20 minutes, which is hard to do, by the way. Most of my clients are like, I did anger work. I'm like, oh yeah, how much? They're like, I'm in it.
I'm laughing because I'm like, this is called acting school. This is like what they made us do, like over and over and over. You can only do so much Italian-American reconciliation over and over.
Well,
anyway.
Yeah. So it's like to give yourself permission, and it's not always going to be so proactive where you're like, I feel okay. Like sometimes it's going to be like you in the microwave, like something happens. And that's like, it's reactive emotions. That's usually what happens first. And when we become skillful with our emotions, it's usually like we at first become skillful with the ones that are just coming up in us. But anyone going through a big grief, I mean, talk about a reactive thing. It's like, like my mentor talks about, like some experiences are like, being squeezed. You're a toothpaste and you're just squeezed and you got emotions flying out of you that you never knew you had. Now, of course, there are people who are going through grief who are having the opposite experience. It's almost like the pain is so profound and big that they can't connect to it because they, the way I teach this is like, it's like a bandwidth issue. If you're, to download a big file onto your computer, you need strong bandwidth, right? And so you need a strong connection. So if you're at the airport and you didn't put your movie on your computer, it doesn't matter if you have a 10-hour layover, you're not getting that movie on your computer because you have shitty bandwidth, right? And similarly, if we're trying to move a really big feeling through us, we need a really strong connection to ourselves. And sometimes when we have a loss, we just don't have the faculty to stay connected to it. Like that's why I spent the first years moving into my head after my boyfriend's suicide, because I didn't have the skills for that. I couldn't possibly. And actually, like, there have been layers of that grief that in the last few years, I finally have the access point. Like, actually last fall, I think I had an experience where I was suddenly like releasing what was 14-year-old pain, like not 14 years old. It was like 25 years old, but I was 14 and releasing the pain of my 14-year-old self. It just stays in there until we release it. Right. So anyway, so you might be numb, you might be mad, you might be like leaking emotions, or you might be really like shut down.
Mhm.
If you are shut down, doing the proactive sessions and working with anger is actually one of the most profound, ways to work. And the last thing I want to say, why it's so helpful when you're grieving. So I think it's both natural to be pissed that you're fucking dealing with a pain like that and that this person's gone, but I also think, one of the things I really like to look at are what are the energetics of emotions. So anger is an explosive, up and
Yeah.
out, rah, right? But sadness, grief is implosive. It's like we pool. We're like a
Mm.
swamp. We're like a river if we can get it to flow, right? But and so people in depression, people who are shut down, people who are like bogged down by their grief, what helps that, if you had a really thick, creamy, rich sauce, what might break it up a little bit is a little bit of spice, right? It's
Mhm.
fire. And so actually learning how to have these explosive releases, learning how to be skillfully with your anger is going to break you out of that swampy feeling and actually give you some mojo for your life. Like, what do people look like? You hear in our common language, people are on fire. They've got their mojo. It's like, someone fired up has the motivation to
Mhm.
act, to change, to move forward. And so anger in these moments and seasons of grief can actually be the thing that helps us propel and find our life force and keep going.
I love that. And I'm so glad you brought that up in that way, because one thing that really resonated for me in retrospect was when I think I read it or she said it, but when Brene Brown says anger is an action emotion, it's one of the ones that makes us want to do something. And there's many that don't make you want to do something in grief. There's I'd say most, that
Yeah.
it's like the withdrawing rather than activating. And so instead of, like, for me, I took away, like, instead of judging that, seeing it as like an activation, like a sign of life almost. And
Yes.
when I look back, I don't wish I got angry less. I wish I spent less time judging that anger
Yes.
after the anger. That's where I think I lost time a lot of the time, and I'm always trying to think, like, people are always like, after 14 years of grieving, like, what can you give me in like 3 sentences or less, and it's like these, so I start to think of these things where I was like, well, I can't fix anything, but as far as the honoring part goes, taking away the judgment, the pre and post judgment around anger, and then, like, being like, okay, I got really active there, and staying curious about it and staying compassionate with yourself, like, when it comes up, which is very
Even
difficult in the
proud.
moment. I was about to like make myself homeless for yelling one time. It was like,
Oh my
it
God.
really erupted from somewhere I had never felt before. So yeah, I can totally see how people do that. So let's just say it's the first
can I just say
time.
one thing about
Yeah.
that? Because I realized, so I would go to this like area. I have a spot where I would go to chop wood, and sometimes I would have time to like walk up the path and get away from the main road to do the chopping, and sometimes I didn't have time, and so I would chop pretty close to the road. And that's where I learned shame and anger are best friends in my body, because I'd be like chopping my logs, and and by the way, these are dead logs. I'm not murdering a tree.
Mm-hmm.
You jerks.
Noted.
But
Noted.
but a car would drive by and I'd be like, don't look at me. But I would just put all that shame rage into the wood. And so I think because we've been so conditioned out of our anger, for most people, there is going to be a shame component. And what I would say as it emerges, like you're saying, I wish I wouldn't have wasted my time with that, but and that would have been great if that didn't happen. But since it did, and if it does for people listening, just channel it into the emotional release. And like the truth is that when you get to the layer of healing where you're working on your shame, it moves, it either moves like grief, or you're like, I'm the worst, and you're crying your face off, or you're fighting back against that voice that's told you sucked your whole life with something more energetic like anger. And so while you're at it, if you feel ashamed, just like work it in, everything gets to move, which is the other theme of the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've reached Grief Club. Leave a message after the beep.
Hey Grief Club, it's me, Addie. I wanted to respond to a DM I got after last week's episode asking me, I'm not in my first year of grief. In fact, it's been almost 3 years since I lost my husband. Is First Year of Grief Club still a good book for me to read? I love this question and I get it all the time. And what I like to say back to this is, first year of Grief Club, if you're thinking about gifting it or getting it for yourself, it doesn't have to be the first linear year of your grief or come to you right after any loss. It can just be the first year you decide to commit to experiments in finding resilience within grief. Basically, it's just the first year that you're willing to honor your grief and stop trying to fix it. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, please send me them at Share My Grief Club on Instagram. Back to the show. There is, a lot of intensity and difficulty around certain grief processes, whether it's, legal comes up, whatever, everybody reacts differently when a death happens. Suddenly, everybody wants something they've never looked at for 20 years. Like all these things happen with wills and all that stuff. If someone's finding themselves in the car right now, I hope everybody else has had this experience before, but where you're just starting to scream at the person. Like you're yelling, like you're doing the monologue of what you would say if you could say whatever you want. And I catch myself, I notice that I'm very angry. Can you walk me through the next 2 minutes if Rachel happened to be in the passenger seat in that moment?
Get it? Yeah, tell him. Fuck that guy. Yeah. You have to, if you're driving, you have to assess, am I safe to be driving right now? Okay. I have a lot of clients who love doing emotional release work in cars. So it's like, you know yourself, hopefully people, are you safe to be on the road? But, if it starts coming up and you're alone, you're not yelling at someone, you're not punching someone, just, can you let it up? Can you let yourself, can you honor it, as you're saying, let it come out? In an emotional, I think that more often than not, you experienced, you're likely going to be triggered around others. And so the real question is, what do you do so you're not an asshole? Because having permission to feel your anger doesn't mean that you want to throw it at someone. Right. Whether you think of it as poop or fire, either way, that's unpleasant, right? It's not safe. You're not safe at that point. And so I would say if the person is not driving alone, but they're actually engaged, it's like, how do you know when you need to go to a bathroom? Because generally bathrooms, you can find some privacy in bathrooms. If you're in a legal building, you're signing wills and there's lawyers, but there's a bathroom in the building, right? Might be a public bathroom, but it could get weird. But, or do you need to step outside? Do you need to walk around the block? Do you need to sprint around the block? Do you need to stomp around the block? Do you need to, can you take up your jacket, ball it up and scream into it, putting a little gentle pressure on your vocal cords so you don't destroy them? What do you need to do? And when is it, what's cool that happens once you start creating an active practice around anger is sometimes something will happen and I'm just like, I'm going to chop to that. I'm going to fucking chop to that later. It's like you start to tell your body, I'm going to move that in a minute, but you have a little more space, it's like once your body trusts, it's just like if we have to poop, and I didn't really set up my metaphor, but I'm just working it in here.
Yeah, I was like, my showrunner brain is like, we need to explain the poop because otherwise, I said emotional potty training, so I hinted at it, and I think we're creating a really big interest in heading over to your work.
The best way to understand how to relate to your emotions is how you relate to your poop, because when a feeling comes up, you don't try to smoke it or eat it or buy it or validate it or social media it away. That the only way, because you were trained to not have that feeling in your body is, of cramps or whatever the signal is that you have to poop, is to go poop. And and then it's not a big deal, and you don't make yourself wrong. Even if you pooped earlier that day, you just that's a good pooping day. You get it out, you wash up and get back to your day. I'm not saying we're all proud of our poops. We don't necessarily invite each other in with our poops, but it's something that generally we know how to do mostly alone. Most people do, if you're, able-bodied and everything. And we don't define us, and each poop, whatever it is, doesn't define us. So imagine if when our emotion comes up, we're like, okay, I need to get myself to a place where I can let that move through me. You don't attack yourself for you're having a feeling, even if you felt earlier, even if you cried earlier, even if you were mad earlier. You don't necessarily think that you are that feeling, or all your feelings are going to be like that. That is that passing emotion, and you go move it, kind of clean up, which looks a little different in the emotional world, and get back to your day, lighter, brighter, less full of shit. Okay. So in that vein, that's what, like my 2 seconds on emotional emotions.
And
as
I just
poop.
want to put in the pause here, because the metaphor also works for somebody like me who does not want to talk about poop. Like, let me just, like, all my friends who hear this are going to be like, you what? Like, you let her talk about what? Like, you won't let me say blank. You know what I mean? Like, but I think it's actually like, I don't want to hide that, because it's like, it's actually how a lot of people feel about their emotions, especially when they're starting to really erupt during grief, is like, this is not right and it should be done in private, and no one should ever know that I do that. You know, especially a partner, a friend, a colleague. Like, the metaphor works that way too. So it's like,
there's a bridge of shame. Yeah, there's a bridge of shame. I mean, I do think there's some shame about poop. I think for most people, they have less shame about poop than the part of them that feels like poop. And I use that intentionally, because it's like, you know, what, like it or not, ashamed or not, you have it and you have to move it or you're sick. You're sick, and you could even die if you don't poop ever, you know, like, so yeah. So in this vein, and thank you for letting me talk about poop on your show. I had no idea you had such poop aversion. It's amazing that you keep me in your circle, given that,
because you're helping me, you're easing me out. You're helping me get used to the fact that the most natural human thing is natural. Again, great metaphor for emotions as well.
Yeah,
you know,
right. And our bodies have other, you know, some people like to use the other metaphors. There are other natural mechanisms for maintaining homeostasis. You know, like sweating, let's say, or, you know, like pleasure, orgasm, you know, it's like, choose your metaphor, but I'm very into this one. I love pooping.
It works. It works. You know,
but so if we go back to anger, you're in the legal situation, you're with the lawyers, it's not the time. Just like if you're like sitting at your desk at work and you have to take a dump, you're not going to do it on your desk, right? So like part of the training is learning, like, how do you get yourself to a place as soon as possible without missing the chance, you know?
My toes and my fingers are crunched. Just literally sitting like this, being like, let the metaphor end.
Okay, we'll let it end, but why don't you breathe into that?
I know, yeah, that's for me to do. That's for me. That's my experiment this week. What's going on with that? Stay curious, buddy.
Yeah. So basically, I think the more we honor our anger, the more we sometimes do have a few moments where we know that we're gonna move it, but we're not gonna do it at someone or on someone. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and that's a hard one to, you know, to remember in the moment, you know, as it's happening. And I think, I don't know, like I did, like in that memory, like anytime I ever had an outburst and, you know, in response to my grief, and there were many over the years and all the complex situations that I ended up in, and not always around death, the other types of griefs too, obviously loss of relationship, you know, anything, job change, like whatever it is. Anytime I've come back to the table, anytime I've come back to the table and acknowledged it, and then tried to make amends with grace and integrity as like, this is a healthy thing, where do we go from here? I've never really, maybe once or twice, but again, that might be someone else's work to do, where it wasn't then, you know, normalized and we weren't able to work through it. So like when it does happen, you know, it's like my mom, like without having any sort of degree in anything or being a coach or anything, recognized immediately as another human being that sometimes we get that angry that quick. And given the circumstances, it's really not that surprising. I'm more surprised that you think this is surprising to me. You know, I thought you'd throw the fridge and the microwave at the, you know, this week, you know, so it's like, thanks for doing one appliance at a time.
Forgiving yourself and asking for forgiveness if you do cross a line.
I do. I really love the metaphor, and it goes right into like the next week's experiment. So we've kind of like done this crossover, which is amazing, because like with feelings and how they come up, I just I think this is going to be very helpful in the sense of just normalizing this when it comes up, and just the myriad of emotions, and that every day starts again and they might show back up. And I really, the biggest thing I wanted to do with you today, and as we close, I'll let you kind of say whatever you feel in response to this, is just, again, we have to dismantle this idea, because anger also happens to be one of the original stages of grief, which people think happen in a linear way. And, obviously that's been discredited in every way, and it's continual, and, like, that's just not the way it works. But when you get it confused with this stage, when it comes back, when it resurfaces, and oh, let me tell you, it does, just like you're never going to stop. I'm going to go there, I'm going to join you. You're never going to stop having the poop. Just wait for my find the funny at the end, because we'll finish this right. But I think that is the thing, is like to also to just get ready and buckle up, because it's also not going anywhere. There will always be anger, there will always be self-regulation, there will always be reactions to what's going on. And it's part of this thing that grief sort of escalates us into like the Avengers. In our school, we have to learn very quickly that you can't control everything or anyone around you within this process, and so the anger is not going anywhere. So I think the biggest misconception, when I'm talking to people, that I hear, and I'm like, this sounds like something you think you're going to complete, or like that's going to end, or like, and I don't know, like I can be very woo-woo and sentimental and whatever, but I don't think there's a day that comes where I'm not the least bit angry that my baby brother died of cancer, or that my dad didn't have the resources at the time to work through depression, or and don't even get me started on the other instant, like, it's just that. And I've come to realize that that's a healthy part of this package. And it's like, you still love them, you still care, you still, it's like, of course, that's always going to be to make you angry. And one of my ways is going back, and the way I address it with myself is that without judgment, and also talk to you like you would talk to somebody, a kid who's having a temper tantrum, and they don't understand why. It's like, you got to go back to that kindness and compassion piece. Or if it's like you're pooping and you don't understand all of a sudden, it's like, you've never done this before, how would you talk to a child about that? But I do think that, like, taking you up on the offer, and I want everyone to know, and we'll tell them where to go at the end, but this emotional potty training that you've provided via your podcast, it's something that you can sign up for, and you don't have to have shame around not already knowing, no matter how old or young you are, or how wise or unwise you consider yourself to be. Emotional potty training, I think, is something that can happen again and again. And it's something that's why I love your TikToks. That's why I love, like, your 1 minute videos, because it's just like, yep, definitely needed that reminder again. And you could honestly repost half of your stuff every single day over and over again, and every day be like, it's funny how I forgot that again. Funny how I forgot that again. It's like,
the video I made yesterday, I'm like, I think it's time to remind you of this. One thing just real quick is actually when I was on a 5-day solo out in the desert with this healer, and I got there and I knew that I was going to have to bring forth fire through wood that I was harvesting myself, and then make a bow drill, which I had tried once before and I failed. And he was like, you failed. I'm like, I know. So he's like, we're going to do it again. I'm like, no. Okay. So that's how I felt going in. And then on like day one, he's like, look, you stopped developing when your boyfriend committed suicide. He doesn't quite talk like that, but kind of essentially. And the arc of that week was like, you pedestalized this person and you were in just the grief of it, and he attacked you, and you need to find your rage. And I did the deepest anger work of my life, and really like fighting back that I was not going to spend the rest of my life feeling like a worthless piece of shit who was left. And anyway, that's its own thing. And I'm not necessarily saying all situations or all suicide responses should be that way, but it was actually probably harnessing the anger that was ultimately so transformative in me actually overcoming that pain, which it still makes me cry. One of the episodes of my podcast is just the memoir of it. I listened to it last week in Lisbon, cried my face off in this really nice restaurant. So it's like, I agree. And I love what you're reminding people of, that this is linear. There are layers, there are going to be cycles around. I personally don't think anyone actually is going to really start shifting how they feel until they go through a full year of everything if you're in the first year of your grief. It's like, you have to experience every fucking thing without that person. And it's brutal. Everything is brutal. And then the next year, okay, it was worse last year. And like that alone is like progress, right? Like last year you were in a worse place. And so, but it doesn't mean that grief won't be there. And it doesn't mean that there won't be anger. And I just think, I will say that I think what can happen, like anger will always be a part of the human experience, but what can happen if you're not carrying 20, 30, 40, 50 years of unfelt anger, if you start to give yourself a place to feel your anger and release your anger, where you kind of don't have a backlog, is that you can start to respond with and who's to say what's appropriate, but a amount of anger that actually matches the thing. And anger then becomes a sign of someone violating your boundary or trespassing. This is kind of outside of the grief context. It's like another way to look at it. If someone has so much fear, they didn't feel safe in their childhood, and so their baseline is feeling unsafe in the world, like their fear will not be a sign of danger. Their fear is like every second of every day they're in fear. But if they can start to move fear, release fear, have fear practices, and they kind of clear out some of that backlog, then when fear comes, it's actually like something's happening. And so ideally our emotions, if we can do some of the clearing out of what's lost, and that's something to say too, if you're working both with grief and anger, like let's say, you're in a big loss and it brings up grief and anger. One of the sayings I like about grief is like, just like all rivers lead to the ocean, any loss can tap you into all loss. It's like, you might lose your favorite sweatshirt and suddenly you're sobbing about this like past family member, it's,
I'm
it's
laughing because mine was not getting sweet and sour sauce this week. And given what week it is, I was like, okay, buddy. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like, this has nothing to do with sweet and sour sauce, but let's cry our fucking eyes out about not getting the sweet and sweet and sour sauce you asked for twice, and it was like, okay. Like, it's like,
one of my teachers says, never waste a good trigger. If it's so hard sometimes to feel our feelings, that if you have a feeling coming out, you may as well let it out, right? Don't clench, just let it flow.
Don't clench. Oh, it's almost over. Okay. I'm kidding. I really am kidding. I think it's such a perfect metaphor that you cannot fight it. This might be what gets me through into accepting my humanity. And hopefully there's no glitch right at the end of this, and I have to just eradicate the fact that people poop from life. But I think this is all going to be so helpful, and I just so appreciate you coming and bringing the tone of what I'm trying to do. I think these conversations can be had in a fun way, even in the depths of grief, and they always can. I, in that spirit, like to finish every episode by just like asking you where you find the funny or what makes you laugh, whether that's directing to people to, the comedy you like, or just a story that, enables that, whatever it really is for you.
Well, the way my mind works, I have to stop myself from like constantly interrupting everyone to make jokes. And I've been looking at that recently, like, when is that a defense mechanism? Like, I went on a few dates with someone who I'm not sure is available, and I was fucking funny, the whole time. But I think just like cosmic irony, just, like the hilarity of the human experience. And just, obviously I like poop jokes, unfortunately. I just have not gotten over that. Each episode in my podcast has a poop story, like that's actually about feces. And they're so
this is
good.
true. I can confirm this is true.
Because also, I'm like, this is heavy shit. We need a break. We need to laugh. And I will just say, even though I'm not doing a great job at answering your question, I've clearly proving it. My entire life has been focused on healing. What would be the point if I didn't enjoy it? Like, what is the point of trying to overcome our grief if we don't try to find joy? And one thing, just real quick, this is also not what you're asking, but I know that after a big loss, you can feel really guilty when you enjoy, and laugh and fun can actually feel like you're betraying the person and like they're not there. And so I know it's complex, but I really just want to double down on your sentiment that it's important, and that, it's one of the joys of being alive. Like in the Jewish prayer you say over someone who's died doesn't say a word about death. It is actually just blessing life. And it's like the miracle to still be alive and breathing and laughing and pooping.
Full circle. Yeah, actually, it's really interesting that you bring that up too, because one of the things in the grieving brain from a neuroscience perspective, and they've done studies on this, is we're actually terrible at predicting the outcome of how we're going to feel. So a lot of people won't do things that will make them laugh or feel joy because they assume they will feel guilty. But scientifically, that's not even true. Like the majority don't. You do feel better. So it's like, also just take it from us that like you are a terrible predictor at whether or not this will actually create more guilt, because I don't know what the numbers are, but the metrics show that,
cool.
that actually, that's not the result usually is the guilt,
Great.
is when you dip into that. So, I
And
just
guess
read
what?
these things
Guilt
and I
is a
just
feeling.
nod. Exactly.
Guilt
So
is a feeling. You
feel
can
it all.
move guilt.
Feel it
Yeah.
all.
Like it just move it through you. No
Okay, I
big
have
deal.
to tell you something that
Okay.
this has been in contention about whether or not it would end up in my memoir for a long time because of the theme of this episode being I don't want to talk about poop. But I have to say that
Oh my
when
God.
people say
You have
like
a
one
poop
of the
story?
most formative experiences of my life was, like the time I shat my pants, because for an ex-perfectionist, A-type, I'm going to orchestrate, control everything about my life, even when grief shows up, like guy, like that is just the ultimate, like you have no say. Like I finally was the speck in the universe that I was on that night in Pittsburgh. And full circle, like 12 hours later, and it was like a full experience. Like I was way too far from home. So we're talking clenching and yelling across the streets of Southside in Pittsburgh, screaming, knowing I'm not going to make it, not making it, recovering, washing everything, and giving a charitable speech in those very pants the next day.
Oh my God.
That experience, and I just went, this is my brother. I mean, like, this is what I needed to learn, though, is you really thought you could go your whole life and never do that.
Never shit your pants.
And it's like, it's such an enlightening experience. And the funny thing about this story is when I am willing to tell it, it's almost always one of those things that someone else always in the group also then shares their shit their pants story, because we all have one. And it's like, it was literally, though, for me, one of the weeks in the book is the excellence versus perfection. It was the death of perfection for me. It just could not be possible because of the way I feel about poop. It was just no longer, like, it just got rid of that operating system. Oh, it was a whole thing. And like my buddies to this day, there's pictures, and every so often they'll send me like, like a reminder that I'm a human being who shat my pants in the midst of
I
grief.
need this story. I need this story. You're going to have to record it separately for me.
Yeah,
the good news for you is I'm
on.
not making episodes right now. And maybe that's a segue into saying what I'm doing. So I won't necessarily put it on the internet, but I really would like to at some point.
Yeah,
I still collect them.
I was coming up for me the whole episode is I have, and my friends are going to get so mad, my bros up at the cottage in Canada. I have recently witnessed a lot of men becoming angry trying to chop wood because they assume that they just know how to do it. My long COVID cough comes out, but like literally, like it's so funny you're talking about it the whole time, and I'm like, oh, that's funny because wood has created a lot of anger in my life.
I've taken a lot of clients out, and some of them I was like, oh, that's not functional.
It's another
like,
non-perfection exercise. You really learn who you are when you're trying to just think, oh, it's easy. You just bring the axe down on this log. And it's like, no, it's really not just that at all. It's a process. Where can people find you? Where can they get more poop?
Well, let's start with anger. I'll just say that I do have, more generically. So season 1 of my podcast is called The Healing Feeling Shit Show. I wrote the jingle immediately. That was the first thing I did. And it ends in a flush. It's hilarious.
It's worth it.
Season 1 is what's really transformative. And that's a free journey. It's a very long journey. The episodes are all really long. They're very thorough. And you can do that. Or I have a YouTube channel that has shorter videos under the same name. And I'm making TikTok, as you said, under the Feelings Movement, But I did make a course that is like kind of, it's less than the cost of a therapy session. And it is a combination of unique videos just for the course, some of the YouTube videos, some of the podcast episodes, and some structure that will guide you through your healing journey and your emotional potty training journey. It's $147. You can pay in 2 chunks if you want. And I wish that it was that this is where we're going to get the right link in the show notes. I have someone who's helping me with the technical side, and I don't actually know the best place to go. But what I will say is you can get into my world. If you don't find me on one of those apps, if you go to yourcorewound.com, that will get you into my world. That will give me your email, and you will have the ability to purchase the course. So yourcorewound.com. And just if you want specific help on anger, there is a 90-minute episode on it in the podcast. There's a video on it. And yeah, definitely find me on TikTok. And I'm trying to get the book out. I'm not actually making episodes of the podcast because I feel like there's only so much time, and I'm not necessarily a talk show host, but I want to be an emotional potty trainer. So I'm focusing on trying to get the book published of this work. But I'm here for it. And I love connecting with people. I love hearing people. If you do go through any bit of that, I'd love to hear how it's going for you.
I love it. And one word for how you're feeling as we check out.
Satisfied.
Connected. Which I want to say, given what today is and what I thought, we are terrible predictors of what will happen. This is proven again and again. I thought I should cancel all of this, and I'm feeling so deeply connected, and I'm so glad we got to spend this time together.
Yeah.
We'll put all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here today and pushing me a little bit further along on my poop acceptance journey.
Yeah, and just sending your heart so much love for tomorrow, and just may you feel the beauty of everything that comes up for you. And thanks for having me on and trusting me with your audience, and and being willing to talk about poop and how you shat your pants.
Okay, I'm signing off before I cough. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Well, Grief Club, that's the show. If you enjoyed it, please let us know by liking and leaving a review. This will help as many people who may need what we're talking about find it the fastest. Remember to honor the journey, and when that gets tough, find the funny.